You've been in relationships with some from famous women. You've dated some of the biggest superstars of all time. Anything you can share with us about Cher?
Weren't you dating Cher before that? And did you
Yeah.
cheat on Cher with Diana Ross?
Of course.
Yes.
Everyone laughed at Florida for releasing thousands of snake-killing creatures. Truth will stun you. When wildlife officials in Florida first floated the idea, people genuinely thought it was a joke. Helicopters flying low over the Everglades, dropping thousands upon thousands of small dead bodies into the trees, all in the name of saving a swamp. Late-night hosts made fun of it. Local news anchors could barely keep a straight face reading the story out loud. Comment sections filled up with jokes about Florida finding yet another bizarre way to make headlines. But underneath the punchlines was a genuinely desperate, genuinely serious attempt to solve a problem that had already beaten every other solution thrown at it for more than 2 decades. And the strange part is this: the ridiculous-sounding plan was borrowed from a program that had already worked on the other side of the planet against a nearly identical enemy. This is the story of how Florida decided to fight an unstoppable invasion of giant snakes by releasing an army of dead mice from the sky, why almost nobody believed it would work, and what actually happened once it did. The snake that ate a state. To understand why Florida got this desperate, you have to understand just how badly the Everglades has been losing. The culprit is the Burmese python, a snake native to the swamps and grasslands of Southeast Asia that can grow past 15 feet and weigh more than 200 pounds. They were never supposed to be here. Through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, Burmese pythons became one of the most popular exotic pets in the country, sold in mall pet stores and reptile expos to buyers who had no real concept of what a cute 2-foot hatchling would eventually become. When those owners realized their pet had turned into something closer to a small anaconda, more than a few of them simply drove out to the edge of the Everglades and let it go. Then, in August of 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida and leveled a python breeding facility near Miami, scattering hundreds of the snakes directly into the wetlands. Whatever wild population existed before that storm, Andrew supercharged it. What happened next is the part that should worry anyone who cares about American wildlife. Burmese pythons in Florida have no natural predator. None. They arrived without the parasites, diseases, or rival hunters that kept their numbers in check back in Asia, and they landed in an ecosystem that had never had to defend itself against something like this. A single female can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a single clutch, and researchers have found nests holding more than that. They eat almost anything that moves, from marsh rabbits and raccoons to full-grown deer and, in some documented cases, alligators. Multiple studies out of the region have tracked the collateral damage, and the numbers are staggering. Raccoon and opossum populations in parts of the Everglades have fallen by roughly 99% since the pythons took hold. Bobcat sightings have dropped by more than 80%. And in the hardest-hit areas, deer and foxes have essentially disappeared. Biologists estimate the python population now sits somewhere between 100,000 and several 100,000 animals spread across an ecosystem covering thousands of square miles. For years, the state's answer to this was simple: send in people to catch and kill them. And to be fair, those people worked incredibly hard. Florida built out a professional contractor program that paid trained hunters by the foot for every python they removed. It created the Florida Python Challenge, an annual public competition that draws hundreds of amateur hunters from all over the country, wading waist-deep into the swamp for a shot at a cash prize. It trained detector dogs to sniff out python scent trails through dense brush. Researchers even started a program of surgically implanting radio transmitters into captured male pythons and releasing them back into the wild as so-called scout or Judas snakes, since males instinctively seek out breeding females during mating season and lead trackers straight to nests that would otherwise be invisible in the sawgrass. Every one of these programs produced real results. Since organized removal efforts began, tens of thousands of pythons have been physically pulled out of the Everglades and euthanized. And it has barely mattered. The math that makes hunting pointless. Here is the number that should stop you in your tracks. Researchers estimate that all of the pythons ever captured and removed from Florida, combined, represent somewhere around 1% of the total population that has actually existed in the wild. 1%. You can hire more hunters, run more challenges, train more dogs, and implant more radio trackers, and none of it changes the fundamental math working against you. A python is one of the best camouflaged animals on the planet, capable of lying motionless in dense grass a few feet from a hiking trail while completely undetected. The Everglades stretches across more than 7,000 square miles of marsh, prairie, mangrove, and forest, most of it nearly impossible for a human being to walk through, let alone search thoroughly. Wildlife officials in the region have been blunt about it in public statements for years. You cannot outhunt a species that reproduces at this rate and hides this well. Something else had to change, and it had to change the target. Instead of trying to find and remove adult snakes one at a time, what if you could stop the next generation before it ever had the chance to grow up? That question is where the idea that made everyone laugh actually came from. The plan nobody wanted to believe. In the past couple of years, wildlife agencies and university researchers working on the Everglades crisis started seriously discussing a method that, on paper, sounds like something out of a bad science fiction movie. The plan involves loading small paper or cardboard streamer packets with dead mice, each one dosed with a specific amount of acetaminophen, the same over-the-counter painkiller sold in every pharmacy in America as Tylenol. Helicopters or fixed routes carry these bait packets over remote sections of python habitat and release them so they snag in the tree canopy rather than falling to the forest floor. The idea is that juvenile pythons, unlike full-grown adults that go after deer and alligators, are still small enough to hunt rodents, and they are natural climbers that explore low branches and canopy edges looking for exactly this kind of prey. A young python that swallows one of these mice ingests a dose of acetaminophen that, to a human being, would be a mild headache remedy. To a snake, it is lethal. The drug interferes with the way a python's blood carries oxygen, and within a relatively short window, the animal loses consciousness and dies. When this proposal first became public, the reaction was almost universally mocking. The image alone was absurd on its face. Government helicopters hovering over one of America's most iconic natural landmarks, dumping what amounts to weaponized rodents into the treetops. Wildlife commentators pointed out that using painkiller-laced bait to fight an invasive species sounded like satire. Social media had a field day with it. Even some conservationists who supported aggressive python control publicly questioned whether the plan made any sense, given how enormous the Everglades is and how comparatively small a mouse-sized bait packet would seem against that scale. It had all the hallmarks of a plan destined to be a punchline instead of a solution. Except it wasn't new. It was borrowed from somewhere it had already worked. Guam, and the war that was won with a painkiller. Long before anyone floated this idea for Florida, the United States government had already run an almost identical operation 7,000 miles away on the Pacific island of Guam. Guam's invader was a different reptile, the brown tree snake, which arrived accidentally after World War II, likely as a stowaway in military cargo. With no natural predators on the island, the brown tree snake population exploded, and it proceeded to do something almost no invasive species in modern history has managed. It wiped out nearly the entire native forest bird population of an island. Species after species vanished from Guam's jungles entirely, not driven to the brink but erased outright, along with widespread damage to the island's power grid as snakes climbed into electrical equipment and caused repeated blackouts. Faced with an emergency on that scale, researchers with the United States Department of Agriculture spent years developing exactly the method now being proposed for Florida. Dead mice, laced with acetaminophen, airdropped into the jungle canopy on small parachute-style streamers designed to catch in the branches where the snakes actually hunt. It sounded, at the time, just as strange as it does now. And it worked. Officials documented significant, measurable reductions in brown tree snake activity in treated areas, enough that the program became a long-term, ongoing tool in the broader effort to manage the island's snake population and give native species a chance to recover. It is not a total solution, and Guam's ecosystem is still recovering from decades of damage, but the underlying method proved itself in the field, under real conditions, over years of trials. That track record is the entire reason Florida researchers started asking whether the same tool could be repurposed against Burmese pythons. It took the USDA years of trial and error to even get the Guam program working reliably. Early attempts at hand-placing bait on the ground failed because the snakes there, much like young pythons in Florida, spend most of their hunting time above the forest floor, moving through branches and vines rather than crawling across open dirt. Engineers eventually solved that problem with a delivery system almost nobody outside the project would have guessed: Strips of biodegradable cardboard, folded so a treated mouse hangs suspended from a small flap that snags in the tree canopy on the way down, keeping the bait exactly where the snakes actually hunt instead of letting it fall uselessly into leaf litter. That single design detail, refined over repeated field seasons, is what turned a theoretically sound idea into a program that could actually be deployed at scale by aircraft. It is the same delivery mechanism now being adapted for Florida's canopy, tuned for local weather, local bird activity, and a completely different snake species with its own feeding habits and body size to account for. Why the Everglades is a much harder gamble. Here is where the story stops being a simple underdog win and starts getting genuinely complicated, because Guam and the Everglades are not the same battlefield, and the differences matter enormously. Guam's forests, by the time the mousebait program scaled up, had already lost the vast majority of their native bird life to the brown tree snake. There was comparatively little left in that ecosystem that a stray dose of acetaminophen could accidentally kill, because the snake had already done most of the damage on its own. The Everglades is nothing like that. It remains one of the most biologically rich wetland ecosystems in North America, home to hundreds of species of birds, dozens of species of mammals, an enormous range of reptiles and amphibians, and a web of predator and prey relationships that has mostly held together despite the python invasion. Dropping poison bait into an ecosystem that intact is a fundamentally riskier proposition, because the bait cannot be guaranteed to reach only its intended target. Researchers working on the plan have been open about the biggest single fear driving their caution: the Florida panther. Fewer than 230 of these animals are believed to remain in the wild, making them one of the most critically endangered large mammals in the country, and cats as a group are known to be unusually sensitive to acetaminophen because they process the drug far less efficiently than most other mammals. A dose that would barely register in a raccoon could be dangerous to a panther, and even a small number of accidental panther deaths connected to a mouse drop program would be a catastrophe layered on top of the python catastrophe. Beyond panthers, scientists have also had to model the risk to raccoons, opossums, birds of prey, and other scavengers that might eat a dead mouse never intended for them, and consider what is sometimes called secondary poisoning, where a predator that eats a poisoned animal absorbs enough of the toxin itself to be harmed. None of this makes the program reckless. It means the people running it have spent years in trials, small-scale tests, and modeling exercises specifically trying to answer one question. Can this be targeted narrowly enough to kill juvenile pythons without becoming a threat to everything else living in the same swamp? So the plan that got laughed at online was never actually as careless as the punchline suggested. It was, and still is, one of the most heavily scrutinized wildlife management proposals in the state's history, precisely because the researchers behind it understand exactly how badly it could go wrong if the targeting isn't right. Consider what a single misstep would actually look like in practice. Every bait packet dropped into the canopy has to be engineered so it snags on branches instead of falling to open ground, because a mouse lying in the open is an easy meal for exactly the animals researchers are trying to protect: raccoons, opossums, wading birds, even young alligators. The dosage inside each mouse has to be calibrated tightly enough to be lethal to a python that swallows it whole, while staying below the threshold that would seriously harm a much smaller predator that might scavenge a drop packet before it decomposes. Even the timing of the drops matters, since researchers have to account for nesting seasons of native birds, the movement patterns of panthers, and the specific months when juvenile pythons are most actively hunting. None of this is guesswork. It is the product of small, closely monitored test plots where scientists track exactly what eats the bait, how quickly it breaks down in Florida's heat and humidity, and whether anything other than the intended target shows signs of exposure. That level of caution is precisely why a program that first sounded like an overnight stunt has instead taken years to move from a proposal on paper to a limited, closely watched field trial. What the early results are actually showing. This is the part of the story that tends to catch people off guard, because it doesn't fit neatly into either the mocking headlines or a simple happy ending. In limited field trials and controlled test zones, researchers have reported encouraging signs that acetaminophen-laced bait, delivered in ways that specifically exploit python behavior, can meaningfully reduce the number of juvenile snakes in a treated area without the mass collateral damage critics predicted. The targeting works largely because of a quirk of python biology. Adult pythons, the ones capable of taking down a deer or threatening a panther, generally ignore a mouse-sized meal entirely, while juveniles, the ones that will grow into tomorrow's breeding adults if left alone, are drawn to exactly this kind of prey. That difference in behavior between age classes is what gives the whole strategy its narrow window of effectiveness, and early data suggests that window may actually be wide enough to matter. At the same time, nobody involved in the program is calling this a solved problem, and that restraint is worth paying attention to. The scale of the python population in Florida dwarfs anything researchers dealt with on a single island in the Pacific, and expanding a trial program into something that could meaningfully dent hundreds of thousands of snakes spread across thousands of square miles of wetland is an entirely different logistical and financial undertaking than anything attempted so far. Cost estimates for scaling the program to cover a meaningful fraction of the Everglades run into the hundreds of millions of dollars when you account for aircraft time, bait production, and years of required monitoring to confirm the ecosystem isn't being harmed in ways too subtle to catch immediately. Regulatory approval for this kind of large-scale aerial toxin deployment in a national park and surrounding protected wetlands is its own multi-year process, involving environmental review boards, wildlife agencies, and public comment periods where exactly the kind of panther safety concerns raised above get formally litigated before a single additional mouse gets dropped. So where does that leave things right now? The honest answer is, in the middle of a very real, very high-stakes experiment that has already outperformed the skepticism it started with, but that has not yet proven it can work at the scale Florida actually needs. It has moved from a punchline to a legitimate tool being taken seriously by wildlife agencies, university researchers, and state officials who control the Everglades restoration budget. That alone is a remarkable turnaround for an idea that spent its first weeks in the public eye as fodder for late-night jokes. The bigger picture nobody laughs about. Step back from the mice and the helicopters for a second. And what this story is really about is how much genuine desperation now sits behind Florida's python crisis. This is not a state throwing money at a quirky science experiment for fun. It is a state that has already tried nearly every conventional method available, that has watched raccoon and opossum populations collapse by 99% in affected zones, that has seen native predators like bobcats pushed out of their own habitat, and that understands the python population will keep expanding its range northward as the climate allows unless something changes the underlying math. The annual Python Challenge generates headlines and hundreds of participants, but it removes a few hundred snakes against a population that may number in the hundreds of thousands. Professional contractors working full-time might remove a few thousand snakes a year.